Hey everyone, Eric Watson here, freelance writer, player of games, writer of words, recorder of videos, and tabletop role-playing aficionado. Welcome to another DM's Guild review, my written and video review series where I take a look at the adventures and supplemental material at the Dungeon Masters Guild website. This video I'll be reviewing the Lair adventure, The Day the Sky Shattered, designed by Wildfire Works, aka Clark Harper and Jessica Carter, for Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. This review has been sponsored by the designer, and a review copy has been provided for the purposes of this review. If you enjoy my videos, consider using my affiliate links for your DM's Guild shopping and supporting me via patreon.com/RogueWatson. The Day the Sky Shattered is a mini-adventure. I think the best terminology is a lair because it is pretty much all takes place within a single dungeon location designed for, it says levels 4 to 5, but that's kind of a slippery slope because there is a big difference between level 4 and level 5. Level 5 is a giant jump in power in 5e, so I think this, it literally it's the difference between tier 1 and tier 2. I think it's more designed for 4th level characters, and in fact it includes 10, I believe, pre-generated character sheets, which I have in different tabs that are used with the interactive fillable PDF for D&D, and they're really cool characters. They've got all the traits and bonds, and they've got the backstories, and they even have like pictures involved. It's really cool that we get all these. Usually you only get pre-generated characters with level 1 adventures, so it's kind of cool that we get level 4 characters, and a bunch of them too. Like I said, there's 10 of them, and then there's actually some character sheets for a couple of the NPCs that you could potentially befriend and add to your party, some of which may have some interesting consequences. This one explores a Netherese crypt, which is part of the Netherol Empire, which is something I'm only aware of through reviewing various adventures. Just your classic Fallen Empire that was, I was going to say technologically advanced, but in this case, magically advanced, and has literally fell from the sky, and now is, you can explore their ruins. I don't think this one really capitalizes on the Netherese like history or empire or anything like that. In fact, the actual hook is you end up exploring this dungeon because of kobolds, and you end up just kind of accidentally discovering the fact that these kobolds lair in the entrance to this entire bigger dungeon, so you just kind of keep exploring and go deeper down. It doesn't really tell a story very well. There's no like central villain, but I do think it hits all of those pillars for a well-designed dungeon. It's got good combat encounters. It's got plenty of exploration with some, levers and doors and traps. A really cool system where you have to like decode a poem that points to. It's got different what are they called, stanzas or verses, and each of those points to a different space you have to traverse through this like gauntlet of a final trap with the actual crypt is, which is very much, I think, paying homage to Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, where he's got the classic, letter, and he has to say, okay, the penitent man, and leap of faith, and all these things, and kind of figure out how to actually traverse all these traps. So I think that it does that vibe very, very well. I think the production values are also pretty good, as you can see. There's very nice artwork throughout. It doesn't do the typical D&D 5e, text and coloration and all that. It kind of uses its own thing, but I think it works. I think the red and blue looks fine. It's a little text heavy in the beginning, but then what we do get, gotta do my little dance because I'm happy about this, maps. Full color grid battle maps and non-grid versions and DM and player versions. They are full of detail. It looks awesome, and it even goes a step ahead of that. One of the things that always bugs me about reviewing these dungeon-heavy adventures is when you have the one, picture of the dungeon embedded somewhere, and D&D is the same way, the actual official books. They'll have the picture of the dungeon, and then there'll be like 20 or 30 pages of content for that, depending on how big it is, and you're constantly having to flip back and forth, to figure out where the, okay, this room is here, and then that points to that over there, okay, and that's over there, do all that. And I love the fact that the designers kind of fixed that issue by chopping the map up into different pieces and then actually putting them on different pages to highlight certain sections. I think that's actually very, very effective. And here's an example of the non-gridded version and the gridded versions, and these are all in separate zip files. There's an entire zip file full of maps, and there's an entire zip file full of all those pre-generated PDFs. So You get a lot of content here, which I'm very, very pleased about, and I love the detail here. Just a really cool use of what looks like probably just basic, like Roll20 style free assets. But you know what? It looks good, and I'm here for it. I think that's works perfectly fine. The actual dungeon hook, as I mentioned, is kind of generic. A bunch of kobolds are harassing, nearby village X, and you're tasked to go take care of them. This area is kind of a little underdeveloped. The kobolds are literally just here in rooms. This is kind of weird too. It's, I guess, 1 and 2 encompasses these 3 rooms in the entrance, and there's a whole bunch of kobolds in there. There's a really nice cutscene you can kind of overhear where this boss wizard is kind of controlling these kobolds just to try to hold down this area while he actually explores the crypt, although it says he hasn't made it very far despite being there for a while, and the kobolds are, making noise, and now have drawn the attention of local adventurers. Unfortunately, what I thought would be a little bit more role-playing is there's no notes for role-playing at all. It's just pure, I think it's just pure combat, because it just lists a whole bunch of kobolds here, and it says, hey, afterwards, when combat breaks out, it says when, like that wizard character will flee if he survives further into the crypt, which should lead the players, deeper into the depths. But the adventure kind of forgets about that character because there's no notes on like if you capture him and what kind of information does he know, and will he maybe even help the players because he's more interested in figuring out what's in here, or how that kind of works. So I was hoping we get a little more of a social role-playing chance, especially because the intro is a really fun thing where, the kobolds are definitely hamming it up as kind of that classic stupid little goblin kobolds personality style, and then the wizard is, of course, the lead villain who's very exasperated with it all. So I thought that was a neat cutscene, but then there's no actual role-playing notes after that, which is a bit disappointing. But once we make it into the crypt itself, I think there's a lot of good stuff going on. There's multiple levers, so the players have to explore the entire area, although it's non-linear, so you could explore them in any order in these different rooms in this hallway. You flip levers, and it turns on all these animated armors and flying swords, and there's this giant bearskin rug here that you have to fight as a rug of smothering. So there's a lot of monsters to fight. There's treasures to find. There's traps to avoid. It just kind of, checks all those boxes pretty well. And then once you've hit all 3 levers and explored most of this dungeon area, that unlocks kind of a mid-boss fight with this nether golem, which is a really cool looking design that you can battle. It's actually it's very powerful, but slightly weakened because it's supposed to be so old. And then once you destroy it, that unlocks the way to the final area, which is the lower crypt. You also find I guess he's a lich, although he still only has, I think, a wizard stat block, so maybe kind of a junior lich, a lich sidekick perhaps. In fact, he's literally a lich sidekick, but he does have a phylactery. I was a little bit confused about what the phylactery, which that's a problematic word, but that's what D&D uses anyway, so I'll use that for now, but there's a lot of problematic things in D&D. I was a little confused because when I think of that term, I literally think of like the classic like urn or something, like is what liches use, but a phylactery can be literally anything that holds that soul of a lich, or in this case, a just powerful wizard. But I believe if you look all the way down at the bottom end, I believe, yeah, it's this necklace. And I love it when you have an NPC in the middle of a dungeon who has very questionable motives, who's basically a villain, but whose goals align with the players. So a potential NPC recruit, although you'd have to give him a body to make him very useful, but he could still cast spells. The best case scenario is if your players let him come along for the ride, and then even give him a body. There's like corpses where the golem killed a bunch of people, and then later on maybe he could turn on the players, and it even says that his goal is to eventually betray them. He'll help them at first, but eventually betray them. Unfortunately, once again, the adventure kind of forgets about him. I don't believe it mentions, because I was thinking the best possible time would be during this excellent finale, which I'll get to in a second, but where the entire dungeon collapses and the party has to run away, is when that wizard would actually betray the party, and that could lead to an interesting scenario, because by himself he wouldn't still be able to do very much against a whole party, but in that kind of situation where time is a factor and he could slow people down or something, I thought that could be very, very cool. And kind of that classic moment from, again, Indiana Jones' Last Crusade, where they're literally having to run out of the place and it's all falling down and they're hanging on, and arms, there's an abyss opening up and all that. It kind of hits all those beats. We get to the final lower crypt area, and this is an insanely damaged a trapped room. And this is a very good visualization for someone like me who I read stuff all the time. But if I can get a map that showcases exactly how these things work, that helps me so much in terms of being able to plan from a DM point of view. And this absolutely nails that. In fact, you could even take what I would do if I was designing this dungeon in Roll20 is I would take this map and then superimpose all these different rows on top as like a GM layer, cut them out, put them on top, and then you can hide this map and then kind of reveal it as you go along with all these different traps being active, which would be a cool way of doing it. So I'm really glad we got all those different, we got 2 different versions here. And what I love about it is, again, it does that Indiana Jones thing where we get this, let's see if I can find it, there we go. We get this poem, and each of these verses is another trap. So each torch in your periphery, shut your eyes for 1, 2, 3, then jump quickly or cease to be. So the clue here is you're supposed to close your eyes or be blinded, and then you have to jump within 3 seconds or else you'll be attacked again. And then the whole thing is different, like spikes shooting out, or the coffins opening and a bunch of poison, flying swords coming at you, all these different crazy events. One of them is the entire, again, Indiana Jones moment, the entire floor just kind of can give way beneath you and just drop into the abyss. I think it's really cool. And it even goes a step further with the handout here and has different versions depending on how well your players are able to translate it from the original language, and has 3 different styles. One that you can barely read, although very cleverly includes some of the most important, step quick, below, the clicks, don't rest, no time, crawl. Even with this version, you can still get some very important clues, which I think would be more fun using this one or this one rather than the one that's fully translated. You could choose, obviously, to do one or the other, or you could choose to do something like this and maybe like smudge out some of the words, and get the idea and still make it kind of interesting that way without necessarily giving your players the full information. But I think giving them partial information would be a lot of fun, and I think that's a really neat idea for getting through any kind of incredible amount of traps like this. Is by giving them that kind of poem with cryptic information that they have to decode, which is a lot of fun. There's no actual boss fight at the end, interestingly enough, and the actual Sky Shatter. So this is the part where I think the adventure doesn't really live up to what it set out to do, because the entire prologue mentions this really cool, ancient Netherese struggle, and this one powerful mage could basically summon this huge astral dragon to come in and destroy her enemies. And really, none of that really, you don't get that sense of story or storytelling from the dungeon itself. And I mean, like I said, you're even there just for the kobolds. Like, you don't know what's going on. You're just kind of stumbling into everything. Hopefully, I wish there were a little bit more notes from like the wizard in terms of what he knows, and the wizard lich, and then also that wizard from the kobolds who is trying to dig in there. Maybe some more clues from them. But I didn't really get a feel for. I mean, because you could have really replaced this with any other. This could have been just any other kingdom's dungeon or some powerful undead or something. I didn't get the Netherese thing from it too much. Although the golem is pretty cool and is supposed to be this advanced piece of technology, so that was very neat. And then when you open the crypt, you find the ancient mage. She's a corpse, and then she's holding this MacGuffin that can summon the astral dragon. Of course, nobody has any idea anything about that. And you have to make a choice whether to grab it or not, which is interesting, because if you don't grab it, you can just walk out of the dungeon, you have a chat with Elminster, and that's the end of the adventure. It's really dissatisfying. So hopefully your players come out, and hopefully you've got an NPC there, which is, again, why I think there should have been further notes with the original wizard, if he was captured, or if the Lich wizard, if he has a way of doing it. Maybe, if I was a DM and the players were all turning around, I would have some way of having him possess a body or do something to where they can lift that, because it leads to a much more satisfying climax, which is the entire dungeon begins falling apart around you. And usually when you do this, it's over, like, it's not as well thought out as it is here, and I think this does a really cool job of breaking up the entire process into multiple rounds. And you're actually supposed to roll for initiative, and at the start of the initiative and at the end, and then on everybody's turn, different things happen. So like the squares are from this crypt are just falling away, and you have to make saving throws to avoid being blinded, or you'll have to make athletics checks to climb the crumbling stairs or fall back down, or there'll be boulders and rocks like, trying to hit you from above when you get to the other floor, which is why I think that would have been a great opportunity for, an enemy to show up or something during this insane climactic fleeing. So it's very interesting that we, for once, don't have a final boss fight, which I think is a lot different because almost every dungeon has a boss fight at the end. Instead, it's just fleeing the scene, and it's done pretty well. Like, there's extensive rules for it, which I appreciate. There's a lot of damage, there's a lot of saving throws, and none of them are particularly difficult, but you have to do them constantly. It's every single, and it's divided up by room, which is interesting. So you basically have to exit the dungeon, in reverse, obviously. And then every single one of those areas has different complications that arise when you're trying to flee. All of that is cool. Then, when you leave the dungeon, because you've got the MacGuffin, the Sky Shatter thing in your hand, you see this cutscene, which is played out in a very lengthy, probably too long cutscene here, in terms of actual text being written. Now, it's very nice, but it's a bit long for a role-playing game. And this giant astral dragon comes out, rips a hole in space, and starts coming out right for you. And then another cutscene, which is Elminster, who is a NPC that, I don't know Forgotten Realms that much, and I recognize the name, is essentially a just godlike, good-natured wizard, literally just shows up and blasts this dragon out of oblivion and then confronts the players. That is what we call a Deus Ex Machina, which is a seemingly impossible, catastrophic event is saved by a rather shocking, usually person or event or something coming out of absolutely nowhere. And that is basically the very definition of a Deus Ex Machina. So it's weird that the adventure wanted to suddenly include the fact that, okay, here's the nethery stuff, here's the, this thing actually controls this ancient astral dragon and it's so powerful, but then we're immediately going to get rid of the problem and still allow you to have a good, solid ending at the end. So it just felt very contrived. I wasn't wholly on board with Elminster showing up. And the solution is, there's probably two different solutions. One of them is to make it so the artifact is not that powerful in general. It can still, I love the climax of having the dungeon collapse, and then the end can be, maybe it's just not that powerful, or maybe it's powerful, but it summons like a boss that the players can deal with, in other words, at that level, and maybe still be very powerful. And the other option is to have it be very powerful, but the players aren't meant to deal with it right then. It's more of a introduction to a longer campaign, which I get is a hard thing to do when you're designing just a one-shot adventure and posting that on there, because you want to make your stuff self-contained so that people can easily drop that into their campaigns. I totally get that. But when you're dealing with a very, very powerful artifact like this, I think, well, first of all, I think having those options would be awesome, just to be able to pick and choose, but this tries to do both things, where it tries to have a very powerful artifact to do this big thing, but then immediately dismiss it and end it and say, okay, we've taken care of the problem, it's not a big deal after all. That's the part that I don't like. Either do one or do the other. You can either have it self-contained in here, in which case the artifact shouldn't be that powerful if you've got 4th level parties dealing with it, or do have it be that powerful, but don't have it be resolved at the end of it. Instead, have that crack starting to form, in space, and now your players are like, oh shit, what have we done? Now this campaign becomes about having to study and figure out this artifact and realize what's happening, and maybe other forces will come after it. It could really be the thing for a whole, that could lead them on an entire campaign, which that can be a tricky thing to ask a one-shot adventure to do, but just give me those kind of options. I do think this is an interesting ending here, though, where given the players' choices in the adventure, they are given a treasure if they hand over the artifact to Elminster, which also feels a little too contrived and I don't know, a little bit of what was the point of it. I mean, I guess you dealt with the kobold still, but it's like, all right, here's your godlike artifact. Why don't you just deal with everything else? Why are we even here? But I think it's an interesting system to mechanically reward the players for making the best choices, which is, ignoring the Lich Wizard, don't get his help for it. Don't take the Sky Shatter, which unfortunately I think leads to the doesn't lead to the entire climactic escape from the dungeon, so that's kind of lame. You get more points here. In this case, what it does is you can add, subtract, and at the end, it adds a modifier for when you roll on the dungeon table. I believe it is the challenge rating 5 to 10 treasure hoard. So whatever number you come up with, you can add or subtract whatever number you roll in that, and that will give the players ideally several magic items from Elminster. But I don't know, it still seems very a little too mechanical, and ultimately, to me, unsatisfying from a story standpoint. I just didn't like that very, very end with, wanting the cake and eating it too. But I liked basically everything that led up to that. The intro is a little bit weak, and the very end is a little bit weak. But the meat of the adventure, I think, is very well done, and it's got the balance of combat and exploration and role playing that I'm looking for. It's got maps. It just seems like a very well designed dungeon. I absolutely love the homage to The Last Crusade, Indiana Jones, with the having to decipher the poem and the clues to get through the gauntlet of traps. All of that works very, very well, and the actual climactic fleeing from the dungeon, I think, is very, very cool as well. But I just didn't like the actual final Elminster showing up and solving all your problems. It just feels a little too anticlimactic. All right, let's go over my pros and cons for The Day the Sky Shattered. Pros: the dungeon features a good balance of combat, role-playing, and exploration, as I mentioned. I like that we have NPCs. I do wish there were a little more notes, and I wish that the NPCs reacted more throughout the adventure. I think that's always and I find that a lot of designers tend to fall into that trap where they will initially introduce NPCs, have a big blurb on them, and then that's it. Whereas I really love it, and I think a good example of this is in Tomb of Annihilation, when the party can acquire all of the trickster gods, and then throughout different rooms of that mega dungeon, it'll say certain notes or hey, if this player has this trickster god, here's what they say. So that's the adventure reminding you hey, you've got these NPCs with you, and here's how they react to certain situations. And especially here, where those NPCs can make a big deal, I would have liked to see a little bit more notes on there. But I like all the traps. I love the poem thing. All that works really well. And the combat with a bunch of animated armors and flying swords, all that seems very thematically appropriate. Pros: I love the trap-filled final room with the poem handout full of clues and multiple stages of translation. I thought that was very, very clever and a cool idea. Pro: exciting escape from the collapsing dungeon with round-by-round complications. Very well detailed and organized. Pretty cool climax. Pro: full-color detailed battle maps with grid and non-grid versions. Super thumbs up every time I see maps, and this does a very, very good job with its maps. And Pro: 10 pre-generated level 4 PDF player sheets, as well as some more for some of the NPCs. In fact, one of the Nether Golem, it mentions in the notes that you can, I don't know how, but you could enlist it as an ally, I guess if you talk to it or had an artificer or something, and then it becomes like a level 5 Way of the Kensei monk. So it has a character sheet too, which is pretty fun. Cons is, as I mentioned, pretty much the very beginning and the very end. I think the whole kobold thing is underdeveloped. I think that could have used maybe a few more rooms or a few more notes on what the kobolds are doing at the time, or how they can socialize with the players, or if the enemy has, or the wizard socialize a little bit more. I just would have seen a little bit more from the kobolds, because that's the whole reason you're there, and it's over in just after that one big fight. And then the other con is obviously the very end. The Deus Ex Machina ending via Elminster is, despite wanting to do the fun cutscene of this world-ending threat coming through and then being poofed, I think it's either outside the scope of this adventure, or that was too much for the adventure. It just doesn't quite work for me. Final verdict: The Day the Sky Shattered explores a Netheril crypt with an excellent balance toward fun combat, duplicitous NPCs, nasty traps, and an exciting getaway. Thank you to everyone for watching this video review. You can see my written review at RogueWatson.com. You can support my work at Patreon.com/RogueWatson, and you can follow our own D&D adventures here on my YouTube channel. Thank you.